In the grand theater of world literature, few adventures blaze as brilliantly as those we bring to life. Here on Echoes of Stories. Tonight, the veil of time lifts, revealing one of the greatest masterpieces ever written, The Count of Monte Cristo by the legendary Alexandre Dumas. First published in serial form in 1844, this enduring classic has stirred the hearts of generations, weaving an unforgettable tapestry of betrayal, vengeance, and redemption. The version you are about to hear is drawn from the public domain archives of Project Gutenberg, preserved for all who seek its timeless magic. And now, the curtain rises and the journey continues. This is The Count of Monte Cristo, Episode 6. The treasure that had long occupied the Abbé's thoughts now meant even more to him. It promised a future happiness for the one he truly loved like a son. Because of this, its value had doubled in his eyes. Each day, he spoke at length about its vast worth. He explained to Edmond all the good that could be done with 13 or 14 million francs in those times. But Edmond's expression grew dark. The oath of vengeance he had taken returned to his mind. He reflected on how much harm a man with such wealth could inflict on his enemies. Though the Abbé did not know the island of Monte Cristo, Edmond was familiar with it. He had passed it often. The island lay about 25 miles from Pianosa, between Corsica and Elba. Edmond had even once set foot there. The island was, and still is, completely deserted. It was a rocky formation, almost conical, as if thrust up from the ocean floor by volcanic forces. Edmond drew a map of the island for Faria. In return, Faria offered advice on how Edmond might recover the treasure. Yet Edmond was far less confident than the old man. It was now certain that Faria was no madman. The way he had uncovered the secret only deepened Edmond's admiration. Still, Edmond could not believe the treasure, if it ever existed, remained there. While he did not dismiss the idea altogether, he thought it was probably gone. As if fate meant to deny them even this last hope, a new misfortune struck. The seaside gallery, long in ruins, was rebuilt. The hole Edmond had partially filled was sealed with massive stones. Thanks to an earlier precaution by the Abbé, their attempted escape was not discovered. Otherwise, they would have been caught and surely separated. Now a stronger, more merciless barrier stood between them and their dreams of freedom. With sorrowful resignation, Edmond told Faria that it seemed God had decided to deny him any claim to praise for his devotion. He had promised to remain with Faria forever. Now he cannot break that promise, even if he wished. The treasure would belong to neither of them, and neither would leave the prison. Yet Edmond's true treasure was not the fortune buried beneath Monte Cristo's dark rocks. His real wealth was Faria's presence, the hours they spent together despite their jailers. He treasured the knowledge Faria had sparked in him, the languages implanted in his mind, and the sciences made accessible through Faria's deep wisdom and clear teaching. This was his true treasure. It made him rich and happy. It was far better than tons of gold or cases of diamonds, which might be as uncertain as morning clouds over the sea, appearing solid but vanishing as one approaches. Having Faria near, hearing his eloquent speech that enriched his mind and strengthened his soul, filled Edmond's life. The despair that had almost overwhelmed him before meeting Faria lost its grip. This was his actual fortune, not a dream. He owed his present happiness to his friend. No ruler on earth, not even Caesar Borgia, could take this from him. Though not truly happy, the days they spent together passed quickly. Faria, who had long been silent about the treasure, now spoke of it constantly. As predicted, he remained paralyzed in his right arm and left leg. He had lost hope of ever enjoying the fortune himself. Still, he thought constantly of ways for Edmond to escape and imagine the joy it would bring. To protect the letter from loss or theft, Faria forced Edmond to memorize it word for word. Edmond learned it completely. Then Faria destroyed the second part, confident that without the first, no one could understand its meaning. Hours sometimes passed as Faria gave Edmond instructions for when he would be free. Once free, Edmond's only thought would be to reach Monte Cristo by some means. He planned to remain there alone, under some pretext that would not arouse suspicion. Then he would search the secret caverns, focusing on the farthest corner of the second opening, the appointed spot. Meanwhile, time passed, if not quickly, at least bearably. Faria had not regained use of his hand and foot, but had recovered full mental clarity. Beyond the moral lessons shared, he taught Edmond the noble duty of a prisoner, to create something from nothing. They stayed busy. Faria, so he would not feel himself aging. Edmond, to avoid dwelling on a nearly forgotten past that now flickered like a distant light in the night. Life went on for them as it does for those untouched by misfortune, whose days pass quietly under Providence's watchful eye. Yet beneath this calm surface, both men held deep, suppressed desires and stifled sighs. These emotions found release only when Faria was alone or Edmond returned to his cell. One night, Edmond awoke abruptly, convinced he heard someone calling his name. He opened his eyes into total darkness. A faint, sorrowful voice attempted to say his name. He sat up quickly, cold sweat forming on his brow. The voice came from Faria's cell. Edmond moved his bed, lifted the stone, and hurried through the passage to the far end. The secret entrance was open. By the flickering light of a poor, unsteady lamp, Edmond saw the old man standing pale but upright. Faria clung weakly to the bedpost, his face twisted with the terrible signs Edmond had feared, the symptoms that once made him doubt the old man's condition. Faria spoke with quiet resignation, making Edmond understand without needing explanation. Overcome with anguish, Edmond cried out and rushed to the door, shouting for help. But Faria, with the last of his strength, stopped him. He urged silence, warning that noise would bring disaster. Now was the time to focus only on Edmond, to make his captivity bearable or to enable escape. The years of work in this prison could not be repeated, and any discovery by their jailers would destroy everything. Faria told Edmond that the dungeon he was leaving would soon hold another prisoner. To that new captive, Edmond would be a savior. Perhaps the newcomer would be strong and young like Edmond and help him escape. Faria had been a burden, half a dead weight slowing him down. At last, Providence had done something for Edmond. He was giving back more than he was taking, and it was time for Faria to die. Edmond could only clasp his hands and beg his friend not to speak so. Then, gathering his composure and strength after the blow, Edmond promised to save Faria again. He lifted the bed's foot and took from beneath it a vial still a third full of the red liquid. He urged Faria to quickly tell him what to do next, and if there were any new instructions. Faria shook his head, saying there was no hope. Still, God had willed that man, created with a love of life deeply rooted in his heart, must do all he could to preserve it, even if painful. Edmond insisted he would save him once more. Faria warned that the cold was creeping in. Blood was rushing toward his brain. The terrible chills, shaking his bones and making his teeth chatter, were spreading through his body. In 5 minutes, the illness would peak. In a quarter of an hour, only a corpse would remain. Edmond's heart broke with anguish. Faria told him to act as before, but not to wait so long. The forces of life were nearly spent. Death had only half its task left. He instructed Edmond to give him 12 drops instead of 10. If he did not recover, Edmond was to pour the rest down his throat. Then Faria asked Edmond to lift him onto the bed, as he could no longer hold himself up. Edmond gently carried the old man and laid him down. Faria spoke tenderly, calling Edmond the only comfort of his miserable life. He said heaven had sent this priceless gift late, but thankfully. At the moment of their final farewell, he wished Edmond all the happiness and success he deserved. He blessed Edmond as his son. Overcome with emotion, Edmond knelt, resting his head against Faria's bed. Faria then shared a final vision in his dying moment. The treasure of the Spadas truly existed. He had been granted a vision beyond time and space. He saw the treasure deep within the inner cavern, dazzled by the sight of such wealth. If Edmond escaped, he must remember that the world's so-called Mad Abbé was not mad. He urged Edmond to hasten to Monte Cristo and claim the fortune, for he had suffered long enough. Suddenly, a violent convulsion seized Faria. Edmond saw bloodshot eyes, as if blood had rushed from his chest to his head. Faria grasped Edmond's hand convulsively, murmuring farewell. Edmond pleaded for him not to leave yet, crying out for help. The dying man cautioned him to be silent, so they would not be separated if he survived. Edmond promised he would save him. Though Faria suffered greatly, he seemed less anguished than before. Faria explained the lesson pain was because he had less strength to endure it. Youth believes in life and hopes. Old men see death clearly. He declared his sight fading, senses failing, and bade Edmond a final goodbye. With all his remaining strength, he called out, "Monte Cristo, forget not Monte Cristo," and collapsed onto the bed. The crisis was dreadful. Where once had rested a noble mind, now lay a twisted, rigid body. Bloodshot eyelids and foam-flecked lips marked the torment endured. Edmond placed the lamp on a stone above the bed, its flickering light casting eerie shadows on the distorted face and still body. He waited calmly, preparing to administer the restorative. When the moment seemed right, Edmond used a knife to open Faria's jaws, which now offered little resistance. He carefully counted 12 drops of the red liquid, then watched. The vial still held perhaps twice as much. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 30, yet no change occurred. Trembling, sweating, heart pounding, Edmond counted seconds by his pulse. Then he decided to make one last attempt. He raised the vial to Faria's purple lips, which remained parted, and poured the entire contents down his throat. The cold draft brought a sudden, galvanic shock to the old man's fragile body. Violent tremors shook through his limbs. His eyes opened so wide that it was almost frightening to behold. A sigh escaped him, sharp and strained, more like a muffled shriek than a breath. Then the convulsions slowly subsided. His body sank back into its earlier stillness, though his eyes remained wide and unblinking. Minutes stretched into half an hour, then an hour, then an hour and a half. In this long period of anguish, Edmond stayed close, leaning over his friend. He kept his hand pressed to the man's chest, feeling the warmth fade away. The heartbeat grew weaker, each pulse slower and heavier, until at last, it stopped. The final motion of the heart was gone. The face turned pale and lifeless. The eyes remained open, but the once bright gaze was now dim and glazed. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. Dawn was breaking, and its faint light crept into the dungeon, softening and overpowering the fading glow of the lamp. Shadows shifted across the old man's features, making them, at times, seem almost alive again. While the silent battle between night and day continued, Edmond still felt a faint doubt. But when the daylight fully claimed the room, he understood the truth. He was alone with the corpse. An overwhelming terror took hold of him. He dared not touch the limp hand hanging from the bed again. He could no longer meet those fixed, vacant eyes, though he tried more than once to close them. Each time they shut, they would open again. Edmond quietly extinguished the lamp, hid it away, and sealed the stone entrance to the hidden passage as best he could before descending. It was just in time. The jailer was beginning his rounds. He stopped first at Edmond's cell, then continued on to the old man's dungeon, carrying breakfast and fresh linen. Nothing in his manner suggested he suspected the truth. He went on his way. A sudden, irresistible need gripped Edmond. He had to know what was happening in that room. He slipped back through the underground gallery and arrived just as the turnkey shouted for help. More guards hurried in. The steady tramp of soldiers' boots echoed in the corridor. Last of all, the governor entered. From his hidden place, Edmond heard the bed creak as they moved the lifeless body. The governor's voice gave orders to throw water on the dead man's face. When there was no reaction, they sent for the doctor. The governor left for a moment, and Edmond caught fragments of conversation, tones of pity laced with cruel laughter. Some remarked that the madman had gone to find his treasure, wishing him a good journey. Others mocked that, even with all his supposed millions, he would not have enough for a proper shroud. Another voice joked that shrouds of the Château d'If were cheap. Someone suggested that, since he had been a churchman, perhaps they might go to some expense for him. But the conclusion came, they might simply grant him the honor of the sack. Edmond caught every word but understood little of what they meant. Soon the voices faded. It seemed the room was empty, yet he did not dare to enter, fearing someone might have been left to watch over the body. He stayed still, barely daring to breathe. After nearly an hour, faint noises reached him, growing louder. The governor had returned, now with the doctor in attendance. Silence fell as the doctor examined the corpse. Then the questioning began. The doctor described the symptoms of the illness that had taken the prisoner's life and confirmed the death. The casual manner of the conversation filled Edmond with indignation, for to him, the abbé deserved love and respect equal to his own. The governor expressed polite regret, saying the man had been harmless, content in his delusions, and needing no special watch. The jailer agreed, saying the prisoner would have stayed 50 years without attempting to escape. Still, the governor insisted that, for official duty, they must be completely certain of the death. Another silence followed as the doctor examined the body again. He confirmed it once more, but the governor demanded full legal formalities. The doctor agreed, though he said it was unnecessary, and called for the irons to be heated. The order made Edmond shudder. He heard hurried footsteps, the creak of a door, and people moving about. Soon, a turnkey returned with a lit brazier. Silence fell again. Then came the sickening crackle of burning flesh. The heavy, nauseating odor seeped through the wall, making Edmond sweat and nearly faint. The doctor stated that this final test was decisive. The prisoner was truly dead. He added that the poor man was now freed from both his madness and captivity. Someone asked if his name had been Faria. The answer came, yes. It was an ancient name. The man had been learned and reasonable in all matters except his obsession with treasure. That, the doctor said, was a case of monomania. The governor asked the jailer if he had ever had trouble with the prisoner. The answer was never. On the contrary, the abbé had sometimes entertained him with stories, and once had even cured his wife with a prescription. The doctor laughed at this unexpected rivalry, and the governor promised a decent burial in the newest sack available. When asked if the last formality should be done in his presence, the governor agreed, but urged them to hurry. The sound of rustling canvas followed, then the bed groaned under shifting weight. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor, placing the burden down again. The governor set the time for removal that evening, around 10 or 11 o'clock. There would be no mass, as the chaplain was away. The governor remarked that, had the abbé waited, he might have had his requiem. The doctor, with professional irreverence, said God would respect his calling as a priest, sparing the devil the pleasure of sending him one. Laughter followed this harsh remark, as the body was placed fully into the sack. The governor repeated the time, "This evening." When asked if they should keep watch over the corpse, he dismissed the idea. The order was to close the dungeon as if the man were still alive. Footsteps receded, the bolts slid into place, and silence returned. A silence heavier than solitude, the cold stillness of death itself. It chilled Edmond to the soul. Only then did he cautiously lift the stone with his head and scan the chamber. Finding it empty, he emerged from the tunnel. In the faint light spilling through the window, a rough canvas sack lay stretched across the bed. Beneath its crude folds, a long, rigid form was hidden, Faria's final shroud. As the turnkey had remarked, it was a winding sheet that cost very little. Everything was prepared. A barrier now separated Dantès from his old companion. No longer could Edmond meet those wide, open eyes that once seemed to pierce the secrets of death. Nor could he grasp the hand that had blessed his life so profoundly. Faria, the kindly and cheerful friend with whom he had shared such close intimacy, no longer breathed. Edmond sat on the edge of that grim bed, sinking into a deep and somber reflection. Alone once more, he was condemned again to silence and to confront nothingness face to face. He was alone, never again to see the face or hear the voice of the only human being who had connected him to the world outside. Yet, was Faria's fate not better after all? The friend had solved the riddle of life at its very source, even though it had brought dreadful suffering. The thought of suicide, which Faria's hopeful presence had once driven away, now lingered like a ghost above the abbé's lifeless body. Edmond considered that if he could die, he would follow his friend and surely find him again. But how to die? He smiled grimly at the idea, imagining himself rushing out to attack the first person who opened the door. He thought they would then condemn him to the guillotine. Yet grief, like a wild storm tossing a fragile ship, stirred fierce emotions in him. He recoiled from the shameful idea of such a death. Suddenly, despair gave way to a fierce yearning for life and freedom. He declared that death was not for now, not after enduring so long and suffering so deeply. He felt that dying years ago might have made sense, but now it would only be surrender to fate's cruel mockery. Instead, he vowed to live and fight until the very end. He would reclaim the happiness stolen from him. Before he died, he reminded himself there were executioners to punish, and perhaps, just maybe, friends to reward. Still, he knew he would be forgotten here and would die in his dungeon as Faria had. As these thoughts consumed him, Edmond became silent, staring ahead as if overwhelmed by a sudden, strange realization. He rose abruptly, placing his hand on his forehead as if dizzy. He paced the dungeon 2 or 3 times, then stopped sharply by the bed. He muttered to himself, marveling at the thought that had come to him. Could it be divine? Since only the dead left this dungeon freely, he resolved to take the place of the dead. Without hesitation, and to keep his mind fixed on this desperate plan, Edmond leaned over the dreadful shroud. Using a knife that Faria had crafted, he opened the sack, lifted the corpse, and carried it to his cell. He laid it carefully on his couch and tied the rag he wore at night around its head, covering it with his quilt. He kissed the cold brow and tried in vain to close the staring eyes, which glared with a horrible intensity. Turning the head toward the wall, he hoped the jailer, arriving with the evening meal, would think he was asleep as usual. Returning to the tunnel, Edmond pushed the bed against the wall. Back in the other cell, he retrieved needle and thread from their hiding place. Shedding his rags, he entered the sack, placing himself in the exact position of the corpse. From inside, he sewed the sack's mouth shut. If the jailers had entered at that moment, his beating heart might have revealed him. He could have waited until after the evening visit, but he feared the governor might change his mind and order the corpse removed earlier. That would have destroyed his last hope. His plan was clear. If the grave diggers discovered they carried a living man instead of a dead body, Edmond intended to act swiftly. With a sudden cut, he would tear open the sack and escape amid their panic. If they pursued, he would defend himself with a knife. If buried alive, he planned to endure the earth's weight until nightfall, then dig his way out. If the earth proved too heavy and he suffocated, so be it. He would welcome the end. Edmond had not eaten since the previous evening, but hunger never crossed his mind. His situation allowed only one thought. The greatest risk was the jailer's evening visit at 7 o'clock. The man might notice the change. Yet, countless times before, either out of weariness or dislike, Edmond had received his supper in bed. The jailer would place bread and soup quietly and leave without a word. This time, the jailer might speak, but if Edmond said nothing, the man might check the bed and discover everything. When 7 o'clock arrived, Edmond's agony began. One hand pressed over his heart could not steady its frantic beating. With the other, he wiped sweat from his temples. Shivers ran through his body, chilling his heart with icy grip. At times, he thought he would die. Yet the hours passed without disturbance, and Edmond knew he had passed the first test. This was a good sign. Soon, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Edmond felt the moment was at hand. Gathering his courage, he held his breath, wishing he could quiet his pounding veins. The double steps paused at the door. He guessed the two grave diggers had come to collect him. Their footsteps as they set down the hand beer confirmed it. The door opened, and dim light filtered through the sack covering Edmond. Two shadows approached the bed, while a third remained near the door, torch in hand. The two men grasped the ends of the sack. One remarked on the weight, surprised that the old, thin man was so heavy. Another joked that every year adds half a pound to the bone's weight. They questioned if the knot was tied. One said it was easier to tie it later. Edmond wondered what the knot was for. They laid the supposed corpse on the bier. Edmond stiffened his body to play the part of the dead. The three men, led by the torchbearer, climbed the stairs. Suddenly, Edmond felt the fresh, sharp air of the night, knowing the Mistral wind was blowing. The sensation was strange, a mix of pain and pleasure. After 20 paces, they set the bier down. One man walked away. Edmond heard his footsteps on the pavement. Edmond wondered aloud where he was. One bearer noted the corpse was far from light, sitting on the edge of the hand barrow. Edmond's first impulse was to flee, but he resisted. The other bearer demanded a light, grumbling about finding what he sought. The torchbearer complied, albeit brusquely. Edmond guessed the man was searching for a spade. An exclamation of satisfaction followed when the grave digger found the tool. He said it had been hard to locate. His companion replied that the spade hadn't lost anything by waiting. The man approached Edmond, laying a heavy metal object beside him. A cord was quickly and painfully tied around Edmond's feet. The grave digger asked again about the knot. The other assured him it was tight. The bier was lifted, and the men moved forward. After 50 paces, they paused to open a door, then continued. The sound of waves crashing against the chateau's rocky foundation echoed clearly. One bearer commented on the bad weather, saying it was no night for a swim. The other joked about the abbé's chance of getting wet, and they laughed cruelly. Edmond didn't understand the joke, but his hair stood on end. At last they arrived. One said a little farther. The other reminded him that the last man had been stopped, dashed against the rocks. The governor had blamed their carelessness. They climbed 5 or 6 more steps. Then Edmond felt himself lifted, one man holding his head, the other his heels, and swung back and forth. 1, 2, 3. The grave diggers counted. Suddenly, Edmond was thrown into the air like a wounded bird. Falling swiftly, his blood chilling at the speed. Though weighed down by the heavy shot tied to his feet, the fall seemed endless. At last, he plunged with a terrible splash into the icy sea. A sharp cry escaped his lips, but it was instantly swallowed by the waves. Edmond Dantès had been cast into the sea, dragged down by a 36-pound shot bound to his feet. The sea was the final resting place, the cemetery of the Château d'If. Edmond Dantès found himself nearly suffocated and stunned, but his quick thinking saved him. Holding his breath, he used his right hand, prepared for any chance, to grasp his knife and tear open the sack that threatened to bury him. Slowly, he freed his arm and then his whole body. Yet, despite his desperate struggle, the heavy sack pulled him deeper beneath the waves. Summoning all his strength, he bent his body and managed to cut the cord binding his legs, just as the choking sensation overwhelmed him. With a powerful leap, he broke the surface of the sea, leaving the sack sinking into the depths, almost becoming his grave. He took a moment to catch his breath before diving again, determined to stay unseen. When he surfaced a second time, he had moved 50 paces from where he had first plunged. Above him, a stormy sky loomed, dark clouds chased by fierce winds, revealing the occasional glimpse of a distant star. Ahead stretched a vast, dark sea, restless and wild, its waves foaming and roaring as if warning of an approaching tempest. Behind him rose the ominous silhouette of a massive stone fortress, its jagged cliffs resembling outstretched arms ready to seize their prey. Atop the highest rock, a torch flickered, illuminating two shadowy figures. Dantès imagined these watchers must have heard his cry. He dived once more, staying submerged for a long time. Swimming underwater was no challenge for him. He was known as the best swimmer in the port of Marseilles, often drawing crowds when he swam near the lighthouse. When he surfaced again, the light had vanished. He needed to find his way. Among the islands near Château d'If, Ratonneau and Pomme were inhabited, as was Dôme. That left Tibelin and Lemaire as safer options for his escape. Both lay about a league away, but Dantès resolved to reach them. Yet, the darkness of night made navigation difficult. Suddenly, he spotted the steady glow of plainer light, shining like a star. By keeping this light to his right, he knew Tibelin would be slightly to his left. Turning left would lead him toward it. Memories of Faria's warnings echoed in his mind, words urging him to keep his strength, to not surrender to weakness, lest he drown. These thoughts gave him courage. He pushed forward through the water, testing his strength. Despite long captivity, he felt no loss of power. He was still master of the element that had carried him as a boy. Yet fear pursued him relentlessly. Every wave behind him seemed like a chasing boat. Each time he rose to the surface, he scanned the horizon, trying to pierce the darkness. He swam faster, desperate to escape, even as exhaustion crept in. Slowly, the terrible fortress faded into the night, invisible but ever present in his mind. After an hour of swimming, freed by hope, he calculated that despite the wind slowing him, he must be close to Tibelin. Doubt struck. What if he was mistaken? A chill ran through him. He tried to rest by treading water, but the rough sea allowed no respite. Resolving to keep going until collapse or cramp took him, he struck out with all the energy his despair could summon. Then the sky darkened further, heavy clouds descending like a shroud. Suddenly, a sharp pain stabbed his knee. For a moment, he feared he'd been shot, but heard no gunfire. Reaching forward, his hand met an obstacle. Another stroke, and his feet touched the shore. Before him stood a strange formation of rocks, twisted and jagged, like a frozen fire caught at its fiercest blaze. This was Tibelin Island. Gratefully, Dantès rose and took a few steps, then collapsed onto the granite, which felt softer than any bed. Despite the wind and rain, exhaustion overcame him, and he fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. An hour later, thunder's roar awoke him. The storm had unleashed its fury, battering the sky with mighty wings of wind. Lightning slashed across the clouds like fiery serpents, illuminating chaotic waves rolling endlessly. Dantès knew he had reached Tibelin. The barren island offered no shelter. When the sea calmed, he planned to swim to Lemaire, a larger but equally desolate island better suited for hiding. A rocky overhang gave him brief refuge. No sooner had he settled beneath it than the tempest exploded in full force. The rock trembled beneath him as waves smashed against it, soaking him with spray. Though safe, dizziness struck amid the chaos and flashing lightning. It felt as if the entire island might break loose and sail off in the storm's heart. Hunger gnawed at him. He remembered he had eaten nothing for over a day. Reaching out, he drank greedily from rainwater collected in a rock hollow. Rising, a lightning flash lit the darkness. Between Lemaire and Quai Croiselle, not far away, he saw a fishing boat tossed like a ghost on the waves. Moments later, it reappeared, speeding toward the shore. Dantès shouted warnings, but the sailors saw their peril. Lightning revealed 4 men clinging to the broken mast and rigging, a 5th holding onto the rudder. Their cries reached him on the wind. Suddenly, torn sails vanished into the night as ropes snapped. A violent crash followed, then silence. Dantès scrambled down the rocks, risking his own safety, but found nothing. The cries had ceased, and the storm raged on. Gradually, the wind eased. Gray clouds rolled westward, stars brightened the sky, and dawn's light gilded the sea's foaming crests. Standing motionless, Dantès took in the majestic dawn, something forgotten since his imprisonment in Château d'If. His eyes shifted toward the fortress, looming darkly over sea and land, a solemn guardian of the waters. The clock neared 5. The sea calmed steadily. In his mind, Dantès imagined the grim scene to come. The jailer would soon discover his friend's body, raise alarm, and the tunnel would be found. The men who threw him into the sea would be questioned. Boats filled with armed men would pursue him relentlessly. The cannons would warn all to deny refuge to a starving, naked fugitive. Marseille's police would scour the land. The governor would hunt by sea. Cold and hungry, Dantès mourned the loss of even the knife that had saved him. His prayers reached out for mercy, hoping for strength beyond his own. Gazing beyond the island of Pomg, he spotted a small Genoese tartan sailboat leaving Marseille's harbor. The sharp prow sliced through the waves, heading swiftly out to sea. In desperation, Dantès wished he could join the boat, but feared capture and return to the fortress. He wrestled with his thoughts. What story could he tell? These men, smugglers in disguise, would likely betray him, so he must wait. But hunger clawed at him fiercely. His strength was fading fast. Maybe no one had noticed his absence. He could pretend to be one of the shipwrecked sailors. No one would contradict his story. Looking toward the wreck site, he saw a red cap snagged on a rock and pieces of timbers floating nearby. Instantly, his plan formed. He swam to the cap, placed it on his head, grabbed a piece of timber, and began swimming across the vessel's path. I am saved, he thought, and with renewed hope, pushed forward. The tartan, sailing with the wind ahead, was tacking between Château d'If and Planier Tower. For a moment, Dantès feared it might head out to sea instead of shore. But it continued toward the islands of Jaros and Calaseraigne, the usual route for ships bound for Italy. The boat and swimmer slowly closed the distance. One tack brought the tartan within a quarter-mile of him. He rose from the waves, waving his cap in distress. No one on board noticed, and the boat changed tack again. Dantès wanted to shout, but the wind would drown his voice. Grateful for the timber he held, which helped him stay afloat and swim, He kept watching anxiously. When the vessel finally turned again toward him, he made a desperate effort. Rising halfway from the water, he waved his cap and shouted with a sailor's cry. This time, his signals were seen and heard. The tartan immediately steered toward him, and preparations began to lower a boat. Almost immediately, a small boat with 2 men rowing swiftly approached Edmond Dantès. Confident that he no longer needed the piece of timber, he released it and swam vigorously toward the boat. However, he soon realized he had overestimated his strength. His arms stiffened, his legs lost their flexibility, and he struggled to breathe. He called out again, prompting the 2 sailors to row even harder. One of them shouted encouragement in Italian. The word reached Edmond just as a large wave overwhelmed him. Fighting with every last bit of strength, he surfaced and cried out a 3rd time. Then, feeling himself sinking as if weighed down by the same deadly cannonball, the water covered his head and the sky darkened. After a convulsive movement, he came up once more, but soon lost consciousness when hands grabbed his hair. When Edmond regained consciousness, he found himself lying on the deck of the tartan. His first concern was to check their course, noticing they were quickly moving away from Château. Exhausted beyond measure, his sigh of relief was mistaken for a mere breath. As he lay there, a sailor rubbed his limbs with a woolen cloth to restore circulation. Another, the same who had encouraged him, held a gourd of rum to Edmond's lips. Nearby, an older man serving as both captain and pilot observed with quiet pity. The kind one feels for misfortune narrowly escaped, but possibly to be faced again. The rum revived Edmond's fading life signs, and the gentle rubbing restored the flexibility of his limbs. The captain, speaking broken French, asked Edmond who he was. Edmond answered in halting Italian that he was a Maltese sailor. He explained that they had been transporting grain from Syracuse when the storm struck near Cape Morgiou, wrecking their ship on the rocks. When asked where he came from, Edmond described clinging to the rocks after losing his captain and crew. He spotted their vessel and, afraid of being left to perish on the desolate island, swam out on a piece of wreckage to intercept their course. He expressed gratitude for his rescue, noting that one of their sailors had saved him by grabbing his hair. The sailor who had shouted encouragement admitted to pulling Edmond from the water just in time, explaining that Edmond had been sinking fast. Edmond gratefully offered his hand in thanks. The sailor remarked that Edmond looked more like a brigand than an honest man because of his long beard and hair, which Edmond explained had grown during his imprisonment. Edmond shared that he had vowed not to cut his hair or beard for 10 years if saved during a moment of danger, and that vow was now ending. The captain asked what should be done with Edmond. Edmond replied that he was willing to do whatever they wished. His captain was dead, and he had barely escaped, but he was a skilled sailor and hoped to find work at the next port. When questioned about his knowledge of the Mediterranean, Edmond said he had sailed its waters since childhood and knew its harbors well enough to navigate, even blindfolded. The sailor who had saved Edmond suggested that if his claims were true, nothing should prevent him from staying aboard. The captain doubted this, noting that in his exhausted state, Edmond might promise anything without intent or ability to fulfill it later. Edmond insisted he would do more than promise. The captain smiled, but reserved judgment. Curious about their destination, Edmond learned they were heading to Leghorn. He questioned why they tacked so often instead of sailing closer to the wind. The captain explained that sailing closer would risk hitting the island of Ryan. Confidently, Edmond offered to take the helm and demonstrate his skill. Feeling the vessel's responsiveness, he gave commands to the crew, who obeyed promptly. The vessel sailed 20 fathoms to windward as Edmond had predicted. The captain and crew were astonished by his intelligence and vigor, qualities they had not expected. Edmond assured them he would be useful during the voyage. If unwanted at Leghorn, he offered to pay for his keep from his first wages. The captain agreed to the arrangement, provided Edmond was reasonable. One sailor protested that it was unfair since Edmond knew more than them. The captain reminded him that everyone was free to ask for what they wished. Jacopo, the sailor who saved Edmond, offered a shirt and trousers, which Edmond accepted gratefully. The captain asked if Edmond wanted anything else. Edmond requested a piece of bread and another glass of the fine rum, having not eaten or drunk for over 40 hours. The food and drink were provided. As Edmond drank, the captain noticed a small white cloud atop the Château d'If bastion. At the same moment, the faint sound of a gunshot echoed. The sailors exchanged curious looks. Edmond explained that a prisoner had escaped, prompting the firing of an alarm gun. The captain looked at Edmond, but, seeing him drink calmly, dismissed any suspicion. Edmond wiped the sweat from his brow, noting quietly that the rum was indeed strong. He considered this a fortunate thing, as he felt he had gained a valuable asset. Pretending to be tired, Edmond asked to take the helm. The steersman, eager for a break, glanced at the captain. With a nod, the captain gave permission for Edmond to take over. This allowed Edmond to keep a steady watch on Marseilles as they sailed away. He asked Jacopo the date, and when Jacopo replied it was February 28th, Edmond pressed further, asking the year. Jacopo seemed surprised by the question, but confirmed it was 1829. Edmond realized it had been exactly 14 years since his arrest. He had entered Château d'If at 19 and now was 33. A somber smile crossed his face as he wondered about Mercedes, who likely thought him dead. Then his eyes burned with hatred when he recalled the 3 men responsible for his long and miserable imprisonment. Edmond silently renewed the fierce oath of revenge against Danglars, Fernand, and Villefort, an oath forged in the depths of his dungeon. This was no idle threat. No sailor in the Mediterranean, no matter how fast, could catch the little tartan as it sped before the wind toward Leghorn. Every sail filled with relentless power. Dantès spent less than a day aboard before he understood the nature of the men he was now with. Though he had not studied under Abbé Faria, the skilled master of Laja and Amelie, the Genoese tartan, Dantès knew a little of every language spoken along the Mediterranean shores. This knowledge freed him from relying on interpreters, who were often troublesome and indiscreet. It also helped him communicate with other ships at sea, small coastal boats, and the nameless, restless people who lived by secret means on the docks. People with no clear nationality or job, supported by hidden trades that seemed a gift from Providence. It was clear that Dantès was among smugglers. At first, the captain was wary of Dantès. The customs officers along the coast knew him well, and since the captain was always engaged in a battle of wits with those officials, he suspected Dantès might be an agent spying on his trade. However, the captain's doubts faded when he saw how expertly Dantès handled the lugger. Then, noticing the plume of smoke above Château d'If and hearing the distant gunshot, the captain realized he had aboard someone whose arrival was marked like that of a king, with artillery salutes. This idea comforted him more than if Dantès had been a customs officer. Yet this too vanished when he observed how calm and collected his new crew member remained. Dantès had the advantage of knowing who the captain was, while the captain remained unaware of Dantès' true identity. Despite the crew's efforts to question him, Dantès revealed nothing more than accurate details about Naples, Malta, and Marseilles, sticking firmly to his original story. The Genoese captain, clever as he was fooled by Dantès' calm behavior, his sailing skill, and his excellent ability to hide the truth. Perhaps the captain was one of those cautious men who only know what they must and believe only what they want to believe. With this uneasy understanding, they sailed to Leghorn. Here, Dantès faced another test, whether he could recognize himself after 14 years without seeing his own face. He remembered the young man he once was and now wondered what the years had made of him. His shipmates believe his vow had ended. Having visited Leghorn many times before, Dantès recalled a barber on St. Ferdinand Street and went there to have his beard and hair cut. The barber stared in surprise at the long, thick black hair and beard, which made Dantès look like a figure from a Titian painting. At that time, such a beard and hair length were unusual. Today, a barber might be surprised if a man with such features chose to cut them off. The barber said nothing and began his work. After the haircut, with a smooth chin and hair trimmed to its usual length, Dantès asked for a mirror. Now, 33 years old, his 14 years of imprisonment had changed his appearance profoundly. When Dantès entered Château d'If, he had the round, open, smiling face of a young man who had lived an easy early life and expected a bright future. But now everything was different. His face had lengthened into an oval shape. The smile was replaced by firm, resolute lines around his mouth. His eyebrows arched over a forehead marked by deep thought. His eyes carried a sadness, with occasional flashes of dark hatred and misanthropy. His pale complexion, caused by years away from the sun, combined with his black hair, gave him the aristocratic look of a northern man. The deep knowledge he had gained showed in the refined, intellectual expression on his face. Naturally tall and strong, his body now held the quiet strength of a man who had focused all his energy inward through long years of hardship. The lean, nervous figure Dantès once had was now replaced by a solid, muscular build. His voice had also changed after years filled with prayers, tears, and curses. Sometimes it carried a strangely sweet tone, and at other times, it was rough and nearly hoarse. Having spent so much time in darkness, his eyes gained a special ability to see in the night, much like a wolf or hyena. When Edmond looked at himself, a small smile appeared. He doubted that even his closest friend, if he still had one, would recognize him. In truth, he barely recognized himself. The captain of La Jeune Amélie, eager to keep such a valuable man on board, offered to advance Edmond money from future earnings. Edmond accepted this help. After leaving the barber who gave him this new look, Edmond bought a full sailor's outfit, simple white pants, a striped shirt, and a cap. Wearing this new clothes and returning the borrowed shirt and trousers to Jacopo, Edmond stood before the captain again. The captain made him repeat his story many times before he could believe it. He barely recognized the neat, clean sailor as the same man who was once found nearly drowned, naked, and covered in seaweed. Impressed by Edmond's changed appearance, the captain offered him a job again. But Edmond had plans of his own and agreed to stay only for 3 months. La Jeune Amélie had an efficient and obedient crew, and the captain wasted no time. Within a week at Leghorn, the ship's hold was filled with contraband goods, printed muslins, smuggled cotton, English gunpowder, and tobacco missing its excise stamps. The plan was to bring these goods out of Leghorn without paying duties and deliver them to Corsica, where speculators would send a cargo to France. They set sail again, and Edmond was back on the blue Mediterranean Sea, the same sea he had seen in his youth and dreamed about during his prison years. He passed the islands of Gorgone to the right and La Pianosa to the left, heading toward the lands of Paoli and Napoleon. The next morning, the captain found Edmond on deck early, leaning on the rail, staring intently at a group of granite rocks glowing pink in the sunrise. It was the island of Monte Cristo. La Jeune Amélie passed the island just off its left side and continued toward Corsica. Edmond thought about how close he was to the island that meant so much to him. He could jump into the sea and reach the island in half an hour. But without tools to find his treasure or weapons to protect himself, what could he do? And what would the sailors or captain think? He had to wait. Luckily, Dantès had learned patience. He had waited 14 years for freedom, so he could surely wait another 6 months or a year for his fortune. Would he not have accepted freedom without riches if given the chance? Besides, were those riches even real? Perhaps they were just a dream of the late Abbé Faria's mind. Still, the letter from Cardinal Spada was detailed and specific. Edmond repeated it over and over, not forgetting a single word. As evening settled in, Edmond watched the island fade into the dim colors of twilight until darkness swallowed it completely. His eyes, trained by years in the gloom of a prison, clung to its outline longer than any other, for he remained alone on deck. Morning found the vessel off the coast of Illyria. They sailed along its shores all day, and by nightfall fires burned on land, likely a signal for their arrival. A lantern replaced the streamer at the masthead, and the ship drew close, within gunshot of the beach. Edmond noticed the captain had mounted 2 small culverins as they neared the coast, though the extra caution proved unnecessary. The exchange went smoothly, for small boats approached with little noise, and the crew lowered their own to meet them. By 2 in the morning, all cargo was ashore. That same night, profits were divided, each man earning 100 Tuscan livres, about 80 francs. But their work was not yet finished. The bowsprit turned towards Sardinia to take on another load, which they would later deliver to the Duchy of Lucca. This second run, filled with Havana cigars, sherry, and Malaga wines, was equally successful. Yet, trouble came when avoiding customs duties. A scuffle left a customs officer mortally wounded and 2 sailors injured, Edmond among them. The ball struck his left shoulder, and strangely, he felt a grim satisfaction. Danger had met his gaze without shaking him, and pain seemed a test he could endure. Even the sight of a dying man stirred little in him. His heart was hardening. Jacopo, thinking him dead, rushed to help, showing genuine concern despite having nothing to gain but Edmond's share of prize money. With the help of Sardinian herbs, Edmond healed quickly. Out of gratitude, he offered Jacopo a portion of his earnings, but the man refused. This loyalty sparked in Edmond a quiet respect, and from then on, Jacopo was content with his captain's trust. Long, easy days followed at sea. With steady winds filling the sails, Edmond spent his time teaching Jacopo, as Faria once taught him. They studied the coastline, the compass, and the stars overhead, learning to read the vast heavens where God's word shone like diamonds in a blue expanse. Jacopo once wondered why such knowledge was given to a simple sailor, and Edmond reminded him that greatness could rise from anywhere. Even a Corsican could become an emperor. Months passed, and Edmond grew as skilled a coastal navigator as any seasoned smuggler. He learned the signs by which these seafaring traders recognized one another, and passed Monte Cristo's rocky silhouette many times without landing. Determined, he planned to hire a small vessel once his current contract ended, using a pretext to reach the island. Yet, he found no way to avoid having others watch him. In the midst of these thoughts, the patron, hoping to keep Edmond in his service, led him to a tavern where the region's most daring smugglers met. There, talk arose of a rich cargo of carpets, Levantine fabrics, and cashmeres that needed a safe landing site. The prophets promised 50 or 60 piastres each. The patron suggested Monte Cristo, a deserted island free of soldiers and customs men. At the name, Edmond's heart leapt, though he masked his excitement, pacing through the smoky room where countless tongues mingled in a sailor's jargon. When he returned, the decision was made. They would sail the next night and, if weather allowed, reach the neutral island by the following day. Edmond agreed, believing such ventures were best done swiftly.